Marcus Bellamy was the kind of man who fixed things. Not just in the literal sense, though he was good at that too. The leaky faucet in the upstairs bathroom, the warped deck boards at the back of the house, the cracked grout around the kitchen tile that bothered him every morning while he stood at the counter waiting for the coffee to brew. He fixed things because he believed that problems, if you caught them early enough, never had to become disasters. That was the principle he had built his career on. 17 years as a civil inspector for the city of Ottawa, reading structures the way other men read people, looking for the thing that hadn't failed yet, but would. For 11 years, that steadiness had a name, Isabel. But for the past 13 months, Marcus had been living beside a stranger. The goodbye, kiss at the door gone. The sound of her laughing at something on her phone in the other room gone. She had started taking her coffee into the bedroom in the mornings, rather than sitting at the kitchen table with him the way they always had, the two of them quiet and unhurried before the day started. She answered his questions in full sentences when she used to answer them in whole conversations. She slept with a careful distance between them that felt less like unconscious habit and more like something she had decided. He had tried to tame it for months. Told himself it was the pressure of the hospital. She was a palliative care nurse at Queensway Carleton, and that work had a weight to it that most people could not imagine. He told himself she would come back, that she was moving through something and he needed to give her room. But 13 months is not a rough patch. 13 months is a pattern. In his hand on the Tuesday evening, he drove home from work in the November dark, was the business card of a family lawyer named Whitmore. He had called that morning. He had an appointment for the following Thursday. He had not told anyone, not his brother, not their friends, not Isabel. He was not even sure, somewhere underneath the cold decision of it, that he had fully told himself. But the appointment was made, and Marcus was a man who showed up for his appointments. He pulled into the driveway at 6:15 and sat in the truck for a moment before going inside. The kitchen light was on. He could see Isabel moving through the window, doing something at the counter with her back to the glass. He watched her for a moment in a way he hadn't in a long time. Not with suspicion. With something older and quieter than that. Grief, maybe. He went inside through the side door. The house smelled like the cedar candle she kept on the bookshelf in the hallway. He stopped in the entryway and stood still and let himself feel that for a second before he could stop himself. That's when he heard her voice. She was on the phone, standing at the far end of the kitchen near the sliding door to the back garden. The door was open a few inches, letting in the cold November air. Her voice was low, turned inward, the way voices get when they are working hard to stay steady. If you are watching Hearts in Silence for the first time, this is the kind of story we tell here. Not the easy ones. The ones that break something open in you before they put it back together. Hit subscribe so you never miss what comes next. Now back to that kitchen in Ottawa. The name she said stopped him where he stood. Renata, her sister. The one she called when something was wrong. The one Isabel had been on the phone with, according to the records Marcus had stared at on a Saturday afternoon 2 months ago, with a feeling he was still ashamed of. "I cannot do this anymore," she said, and her voice cracked on the last word in a Marcus had not heard in 11 years. He pressed himself against the wall of the hallway, not to eavesdrop, because his legs had stopped working. "He doesn't know," she said. "I cannot tell him. Not now, not after everything. I didn't want him carrying this on top of the practice." A pause, the sound of her exhaling slowly. "The results came back last week. It spread to the lymph nodes." Marcus heard his own heartbeat. "I've been in treatment month for 11 months, Renata. I've been going to the clinic on baseline while he thinks I have morning shifts. I didn't want him watching me the way he watches things that are about to fail." The lawyer's business card was still in his jacket pocket. He became aware of it, the way you become aware of something that should not be there. A small and terrible wait. 13 months of silence. 13 months of distance and cold mornings and careful space on their side of the bed. 13 months of him building a theory of abandonment while the real story, the one he had never thought to look for, had been happening 3 blocks away at a clinic on Baseline Road. He had not been losing his wife. His wife had been fighting for her life. To understand how Marcus ended up in that hallway on a Tuesday evening in November, you have to go back to the beginning of the crack. Not the moment it broke open, the moment it first appeared. 13 months earlier, Marcus and Isabel Bellamy had been the kind of couple that made other couples slightly envious without quite knowing why. Not because they were showy about it. They were private people, both of them, in the particular way that people from older Ottawa families tended to be. But they were genuinely good together. They moved through a room the same way. They had a language of small gestures that only long years produce. In the autumn before everything changed, Marcus had been promoted to lead municipal inspector for the Eastern District. A long time coming. His father, who had spent 32 years with the city before his retirement, had called to say he was proud, and that was not a sentence his father said often. Isabel had made his mother's recipe for tourtière that night without being asked, because she remembered it was the dish his family made for celebrations, and they had eaten it at the kitchen table with a bottle of red wine while the maple outside the window turned. 6 weeks later, Isabel changed. Not dramatically. Not in a way that would have alarmed anyone watching from outside. Just a small, progressive withdrawal that began with the morning coffees and moved through every layer of their shared life over the weeks that followed. She stopped reaching for his hand in the car. She started keeping her phone face down on every surface. She began coming home late and offering short explanations that were technically complete but somehow thin. He told himself it was the work. Palliative care demands things of a person that leave marks. He knew that about her, and he respected it. But then their daughter Sophie called from Kingston on a Sunday afternoon and said, carefully, "Is everything okay with you and Maman?" And Marcus had pulled the truck over on the 417 and sat there in the autumn rain because he didn't know what to say. What Marcus was experiencing has a name in family psychology: ambiguous loss, a concept developed by researcher Dr. Pauline Boss to describe the particular anguish of losing someone who is still physically present. The person is there, at the same table, under the same roof, but emotionally unreachable. And because you cannot mourn someone who is still standing in front of you, the mind does what minds do when deprived of real information. It manufactures an explanation. For Marcus, the explanation the mind manufactured was suspicion. He began noticing the phone, the calls to Renata that appeared again and again in the records, when he finally, with a shame he could not fully justify and could not put down, pulled up the account on a Saturday when Isabel was at work. Renata's number, constantly, and one other number, recurring, that he did not recognize. A medical exchange, as it turned out, though he would not know that for 13 months. This is where a second pattern enters the story: the demand-withdraw cycle. One partner, sensing distance, begins to move toward the other, asking questions, looking for openings, trying to find the break in the wall. The other partner, overwhelmed by what they are carrying, withdraws further. The pursuit triggers retreat. The retreat triggers harder pursuit. Two people caught in the same loop, each one's behavior producing exactly the reaction they are most afraid of. Isabel's silence made Marcus more convinced something was wrong. Marcus's growing unease made Isabel retreat deeper behind the story she had constructed to protect him. Neither of them could see the loop. That is what makes it so quietly devastating. He called his brother Colin on a Wednesday night in September. Colin listened to all of it without interrupting, which was unusual for him, and then said, "You know her, Marcus. You know her better than you know anything. Don't file the paperwork before you actually ask the question." Marcus had not asked the question. He had made the appointment with the lawyer instead, not out of anger. The anger had burned itself out somewhere around month 7. What replaced it was the particular exhaustion of a man who has been leaning against a locked door for over a year and has finally decided to stop leaning. And now he was standing in his own hallway with a lawyer's business card in his pocket, listening to his wife tell her sister that her cancer had spread to the lymph nodes, and she had been making the drive to the clinic on Baseline Road for 11 months while he slept in the next room, not knowing any of it. He walked back out the side door. He sat down on the back step in the November cold without his coat. He put his face in both hands. He stayed there until the cold got into his bones and he couldn't feel his fingers anymore. When he finally went back inside, Isabel was in the kitchen making tea, her back to him, and she said without turning around, "I saved you some dinner. It's in the oven." Her voice was the careful, composed voice she had been using with him for a year. The voice that kept everything behind it. He said, "Thank you." He went upstairs. He sat on the edge of the bed in the dark for a long time. Has someone you loved ever tried to protect you by disappearing? Not from your life, just from themselves. Drop a word in the comments, stayed or walked, because what Marcus does in the hours that follow is going to ask something of you. He did not sleep. He listened to Isabel come upstairs, listened to the sounds she made moving quietly through the bathroom, listened to her settle into her side of the bed with the deliberate care she had been using all year. The care of someone trying very hard not to wake a person who, she believed, did not know she was falling apart. He lay in the dark and let the engineer in him do what it had always done. Not react, assess, survey the full structure before touching a single thing. The following evening, he came home at his normal time. He made no sign of what he knew. He ate dinner across from her and asked about her day and listened to her careful answer and said nothing that wasn't ordinary. After dinner, he asked Sophie to step outside with him. Sophie was 22, back in Ottawa for the week while her apartment in Kingston was being renovated. She had been watching her parents with the same quiet attention for a year now, and she had her mother's instinct for when something was about to be said. They stood on the back step under the light. "Tell me what you know," he said. Sophie pressed her lips together. Her eyes filled immediately. "I found out 4 months ago," she said. "I came home for Thanksgiving, and Maimon was sick after a treatment, and she didn't hear me come in. She made me promise. Did she tell you what it was?" Sophie nodded. She said it was her chest. She said it was under control. She said by the time it was over, she was going to tell you everything, and you would never have to know how bad it was. Marcus put his arm around his daughter, and she folded into his side and cried the way she hadn't in years, the way children cry when they have been carrying something far too long and someone has finally told them they don't have to carry it anymore. "You don't owe anyone an apology," he said. Not a single word of it. What had just happened in that backyard illustrates something important about how families respond to crisis. When a household is facing something that threatens its most essential member, family members will sometimes, without sitting down and formally agreeing to do so, organize themselves around a shared silence. One person decides that protecting the person they love most requires concealment. Another is brought in to help carry the weight. Then another, and slowly, without any single conversation in which everyone agrees, a wall is built. The people inside the wall believe they are doing something loving. They are, in their way, trying to. But secrecy doesn't contain pain, it conducts it. It moves through a family the way cold moves through an old house, not dramatically but steadily until you feel it in every room. Sophie had been carrying her mother's secret for 4 months in silence. The same silence the adults around her had modeled. Marcus went inside. He found Isabel in the living room, with a book open on her lap that she wasn't reading. She looked up when he came through the door and something moved across her face. The instinct to compose herself, followed immediately by the knowledge that it was too late for that. He sat down across from her, not beside her. Across. He needed to see her face. "I heard you on the phone with Renata last night," he said. The color left her entirely. She set the book down. Her hands went flat on her thighs, and the particular gesture he had learned over 11 years meant she was trying to steady herself. "How much?" she asked. Her voice barely made it out. "All of it," he said. She didn't cry immediately. She sat very still for a moment, and he watched her face move through something, relief and shame and exhaustion arriving at the same time, the expression of a person who has been holding something closed for so long that having it open is almost indistinguishable from collapse. Then she folded forward, and the tears that came were not the quiet, private tears she had been keeping to herself for a year. These were something else, the kind of tears that happen when a person has been alone with something too large for one person, and they are suddenly, finally, not alone with it anymore. "I was diagnosed 11 months ago," she said. "Stage 2. They caught it early enough to treat it, but 3 months ago the scans showed spread to 2 lymph nodes. They changed the treatment plan." She pressed her hands to her face. "I should have told you the night it happened. I know that. I have always known that." He waited. "Your father," she said. "I was there with you when he got his diagnosis, Marcus. I watched what that year did to you. I watched what it did to Colin. And I thought, I genuinely believed, that the most loving thing I could do was make sure you didn't have to live through that again with me." She looked up at him. "I know how that sounds now. I know. What you just heard Isabel describe is one of the most well-documented and quietly devastating patterns in family psychology. It is called the protector trap. It occurs when a person who loves deeply convinces themselves that suffering in private is a form of gift-giving. That if they can absorb the worst of it before it reaches the people they love, they will have done something noble. From the inside, the logic is genuine. It feels like sacrifice. But what research in family systems consistently shows is this: hidden suffering does not stay hidden. It changes the atmosphere of a home. It reshapes the way a person moves through a room, reaches for the ones they love, allows themselves to be touched. Concealment does not protect the people around you. It isolates them. It leaves them standing outside a locked room, inventing their own explanations for why they cannot get in. Isabel had hidden her illness because she loved Marcus with everything she had, and in doing so, she had almost lost him. This is not a character flaw. It is a deeply human response, especially in people who have already watched illness move through a family and leave damage behind it. Isabel had seen what Marcus's father's cancer had done to that household. The particular fear that took hold, the way everyone started looking at the sick person as if they were already a little bit gone. And when her own diagnosis arrived, her instinct was ancient and immediate. "If I become the fragile one, I will lose the thing I cannot afford to lose." She was wrong. But she was wrong in the way that people are wrong when they are frightened and acting from love and not thinking clearly. And there is a difference. Marcus rose from the chair. He crossed the room without saying anything, and he put his arms around her. For the first time in 13 months, really put his arms around her the way he used to, and she gripped the back of his shirt with both hands and held on. When she steadied, he pulled back and looked at her. "What are we actually dealing with?" he said. "Tell me all of it." She told him. She told him about the day she found the lump at work on a break, standing in the staff bathroom at Queensway Carlton, the building where she had spent a decade helping other people face exactly this thing. She told him about sitting in her car in the parking garage for 90 minutes before she could drive home. She told him about calling Renata first because Renata was a physician and would not fall apart, and then calling their family doctor, and then beginning the process of telling everyone except the person who mattered most. "Why not me?" he asked. Not as an accusation. The way a person asks when they genuinely need to understand. She was quiet for a moment. "Because with everyone else," she said, "I could fall apart and then put myself back together before I saw them again. But with you," she stopped. "With you, I was afraid that if I came apart in front of you, I would never be able to stop, and I was terrified that if I told you, you would stay out of duty, that I would look at you every day and see the obligation in your eyes instead of the love." And I couldn't. I couldn't survive that. That makes sense, he said. That doesn't make it right. But it makes sense. He told her his side of it. He did not spare her. He told her about the phone records, about the months of suspicion, about Colin's advice that he ignored, about the lawyer's card still in the pocket of the jacket he had worn that evening. He let her feel the full weight of it because she deserved to know what the silence had cost, the same way he now knew what hers had cost. When he finished, she was quiet. Then she said, "There were nights I thought about ending it myself. The marriage. Filing before you did, setting you free, before you had to watch it get worse." She looked at her hands. "I thought, he doesn't know the real reason for any of this. He's going to leave. And maybe the kindest thing I can do is let him go first, before it gets harder." He stared at the wall. Two people, the same house, the same wound, approached from exactly opposite directions. Both of them so devoted to protecting the other that they had nearly destroyed the only thing worth protecting. He reached over and covered her hand with his and held it. The following morning, Marcus stood at the kitchen table before Sophie came downstairs. The lawyer's business card was in front of him. He looked at it for a moment. Then he took it between his fingers and tore it down the middle and put the pieces in the recycling under the sink. Sophie appeared in the doorway in her socks, with her hair still flattened from sleep, and she looked at the recycling, and she looked at her father, and she crossed the kitchen in 3 steps and wrapped her arms around both her parents simultaneously. Isabel had come in behind him with the specific, uncomplicated ferocity of someone who has been holding their breath for months. "Our family," Sophie said into the middle of it. Just those 2 words. Nothing else. Isabel laughed, a real one. The sound of it moved through Marcus like something returning. Over the weeks that followed, Marcus did the things that needed doing with the same steadiness he brought to every problem that required him to slow down and think before acting. He called the clinic on baseline and asked to be included in every appointment going forward. He sat in the waiting room during Isabel's next treatment without being asked and did not make it a statement about what had happened before. He was simply there. He drove her home. He made tea. He did not cry until he was alone in the truck in the clinic parking lot, and then he let himself cry fully, and then he drove home. They began seeing a counselor together, not because the marriage was still in crisis. It wasn't, but because both of them had been raised, in different ways, to believe that suffering privately was a form of strength. Marcus, in the tradition of the man who holds things together without showing strain. Isabel, in the tradition of the caregiver who gives and treats her own need for care as a kind of indulgence. They had both been operating from the same inherited script. They had both been paying the same price. What the counselor gave them, session by session, was not a list of rules. It was a language, a way of saying, "I am scared and I am struggling, and I need you," without either of them experiencing it as failure. For 2 people who had spent their lives absorbing difficulty quietly, learning to receive turned out to be the hardest work of all. They told Colin. They told Sophie everything she hadn't known. They had a long, difficult conversation with Renata that began uncomfortably and ended with everyone at the kitchen table at 11 o'clock on a Thursday night eating over pasta because no one had the energy to go home. The dinners got louder. Sophie started calling every Sunday instead of every other week. The distance that had lived in the house, like a cold draft from a door that wouldn't close properly, slowly, gradually, stopped. True repair in a family is almost never a single moment. It is a series of choices made daily to keep choosing honesty over the comfort of distance, to keep saying "I am here" instead of "I am fine." What Marcus and Isabel were building in those months was not a return to what they had been before. They were becoming something more honest than that, more deliberately chosen. A marriage that had been tested at its foundations and had not collapsed, and was now, carefully, imperfectly, with occasional backsliding, being rebuilt with full knowledge of where the weakness had been. Repaired load-bearing structures often hold more weight at the point of repair than anywhere else, because that point has been examined and reinforced and rebuilt with complete understanding of what failed and why. 3 months after that November evening in the hallway, Isabel's oncologist called on a Wednesday afternoon. Marcus was sitting at the kitchen table when she answered. She had told him about the call the night before, quietly, with the particular calm of someone who has learned to share the weight of things rather than carry them alone. He sat across from her while she listened. He watched her face, and he watched the exact moment the oncologist said the words that mattered. Because Isabel's eyes closed, her hand found his on the table, and the exhale she released had been building inside her for 11 months. Clear, the doctor said. The treatment was successful. She was in remission. They did not say anything for a long time. They sat at the kitchen table in the afternoon light with their hands together and did not need to. That spring, on a Saturday in late April, when the tulips along the front walk were finally open and the Ottawa River was running high and cold and bright, Marcus and Isabel renewed their vows in the backyard of the house on Thornbury Drive. It was a small gathering. Colin was there, and Sophie, and Renata, and a few people who had mattered to them long enough to deserve to be present. Marcus held his wife's hands in the April light and looked at her for a long moment before he spoke. "I spent 13 months trying to read what was wrong with us," he said. "I was good at finding cracks. That was my job. But I was looking in the wrong place. I was looking for evidence of what I feared most instead of asking the person I loved most what was actually happening." He stopped. "I am asking you right now, in front of everyone who has ever mattered to us, to let me in. Whatever comes next, whatever we're carrying, I want to carry it with you. That's the only structure I want to build." Isabel smiled at him through everything. She had been crying since he started speaking, and she was not going to stop. "Thank you," she said, "for hearing me, and for staying." Sophie cheered from the small row of chairs behind them. Renata, who prided herself on composure in difficult situations, had long since given it up. The cancer was gone, the marriage had survived, and the crack that Marcus had once been convinced would bring the whole structure down had become, with time and care, and the willingness to finally ask the right questions, the strongest part of the foundation. But that evening, long after the guests had gone and Sophie was asleep on the pullout in the study and Isabel was in the kitchen making the last of the tea, Marcus's phone lit up on the patio table where he had left it. A text, no name attached, a number he did not recognize. "Marcus, there's something about those 13 months you still don't know. It wasn't only Isabel. Someone else in your family has been keeping something from you, and it's bigger than the illness." He read it twice. The April air was cool and still around him. The lights in the kitchen window were warm. He could see Isabel moving behind the glass, unhurried, at home in herself in a way she hadn't been in over a year. He picked up the phone and went inside. He set it on the counter beside her, let her read it, watched her face while she did. Her expression did not change in the way he expected. She set the phone down. She looked at the window for a moment, then she looked back at him, and her eyes were steady. But her smile arrived just a half beat too late. "Isabel," he said. Her name, just that. She looked at him for a long moment in the warm kitchen of the house they had almost left, and she said quietly, "I think we need to sit down."